There you go.
All right, everyone, we're here. Thank you all for joining us for the first installment of what I think we're calling Environmental Film Club. So we're going to be watching films, short docs independently, and then coming here and you'll have a chance to chat with us and our team about what we saw and what we learned and how it relates to the work that we're doing out here. So today, the discussion is going to be with three incredible members of our team. Melissa Schlag, who is our climate advocate. Melissa leads our new youth engagement effort, specifically working with a lot of the climate youth groups around the state of Connecticut. She is also heavily involved up in Hartford and with all of our climate advocacy efforts, and really also is sort of a jack of all trades around the office when we're in the office. Always there to help other folks. So welcome, Melissa. We're also with Gwen Macdonald, our Director of Ecological Restoration, whom I work very closely with. Gwen leads all of our hands-on restoration projects on all the various scales we work at, from small scale like rain gardens all the way up to dam removals and large marsh restoration and connectivity projects. Oh, Tracy's joining. And finally, our president, Curt Johnson. Curt has been with Save the Sound for 27 years. And
Yikes.
and we're very lucky to have him as at the helm, especially in times like these. We're grateful for his leadership. And as a result of being here 27 years, Curt knows basically all there is to know about environmental issues in the Long Island Sound region. So we're really, really excited to have this group together. And I'm Anthony Allen. I am our ecological communications specialist. So I work with our ecological restoration team as well. So without further ado, welcome everyone, and start just by saying, I hope everyone enjoyed Blueback. It was a really interesting film. I think they touched on a lot of different things in 10.5 minutes. We chose this film for Earth Day, in part because a big part of the work that we do focuses on the interconnectivity of natural systems, and how even if it's a small place in Washington, it's all connected, and we're all on this blue dot together. And the issues that are portrayed in the film and depicted in the film really touch on a lot of the different aspects of the work that we do here. So restoration, hands-on ecological restoration, working to reverse man-made environmental harms. In that case, it was deforestation. In this case, a lot of times it's dams. And also counteracting or addressing the elephant in the room that is climate change. So there's a lot of layers to that film. And also, you know, there's issues of environmental justice in it. And so that's something that is really important to talk about as well. So we felt like there was a great cross section of a lot of different ideas. And while it's not in our region, it's on our planet, and there's a lot of the same issues at work. And so one of the things we want to do today or tonight was talk with you all about, you know, what those connections are to our work here, and how it's similar, how it's different, and what we can learn from what's happened over there, and what's happened, and what lessons we can offer from our work here to what they do out there. All right, so I'll kick it off with a question. I have a lot of questions for these folks because I know them and I know how much they know. Uh, so the first one I'll throw around the horn. I'll give it to everybody, and that is, what's one thing, an image or a line or a fact that stuck with you from the film?
The image that sort of repeated itself throughout that struck me is actually the cedar and the wood that was present. So there was present both in the cooking of salmon in the sort of traditional ceremonial sense. It was really important. There's those really striking photos of all the deforestation and stripping of the landscape. But then in the photos of restoration, you see both wood being used to as the tool for restoring stream channels, and then finally, wood visible on the shoreline that provides habitat for estuarine creatures. And that use of a material that decays and itself provides nutrients is something that it happens on this coast as well as on that coast. But that image was really struck me as just how versatile that one plant really is, and how present it was in different parts of the film.
Curt, what about you? What's stuck with you or struck you?
Well, I think what struck me the most was the elder fisherman talking about the abundance of these salmon in his youth. And, that image of abundance, I think it's so critical. It's so critical for, it's a story that transcends spiritual life for many people, loaves and the fishes, this idea of abundance in nature, manna, fish, plentitude. It's such a critical thing for us to strive for. And, one of the things that struck me when I was young on the Sound, my brother and I and many people who grew up there were almost no striped bass. That's our big predator fish in Long Island Sound, one of them, striped bass. And they were as rare as hen's teeth. And it took a concerted effort by, I want to say, 10 states up and down the coast, a moratoria for at least 10 years, and then the Clean Water Act and all the work that was done here in Long Island Sound and up and down the coast to clean up our rivers to bring those fish back. We're not really at a state, I would say, of abundance, but they're becoming more plentiful, and that is a critical image to strive for.
Yeah. Melissa, how about you?
Sure. Well, I was definitely struck mostly by the Quinault scientist Larry Gilbertson's comment that the blueback are the canary in the coal mine. I find it ironic that canaries were used as an early warning tool for humans of lack of clean air. Now, countless other species are giving their clues to us. The question is, are we listening? And luckily we are listening, especially in our region. As the Quinault fisherman and elder Butch Pope also said, we all have to work together. That's half the battle. And every day I'm reminded how many people care about our environment and fight hard to leave our world a better place for the future. And I'm extremely proud of all the work that Gwen does and all the Save the Sound team. We have an extensive toolkit from legislative advocacy to legal action, engineering, environmental monitoring, hands-on volunteer effort. Everybody is working together and listening to the species around us as they give us their clues.
It was extremely well said. Yeah. So I have a lot of questions, like I said, and if anyone has questions that they want to jump in with, you are more than welcome at any time. Otherwise, I will just keep going. So I think I'd like to go to Gwen right now and just ask about the restoration practices that we saw. This film really has sort of an arc to it where, the blueback were so abundant for so long that the Quinault people couldn't imagine them not being abundant. And then the deforestation happens, and maybe you could also explain a little bit like why that, or how that affected their habitat, and why restoration was necessary. But then they went through all these restoration efforts. They started bringing them back, and now are facing issues related to climate change. So on sort of that first part of the arc, what do we mean when we say ecological restoration, and what practices are they using out there? Could you break those down a little bit for us?
Sure. Thanks, Anthony. So ecological restoration, in the way that we practice it and the way that it's shown in the film is, we're thinking about it as helping and assisting Mother Nature. It's appropriate for this Earth Day, and working towards restoring function and process, not form. So the way that that's used in the film is similar to how we do it here, but there are some differences. So we see when they're talking about there's not any space for the salmon, what's actually happening is that the trees there, that forest is physically holding the soil, and so with the trees removed, there's a whole unraveling of the ecosystem that happens, and flattening out of the actual rivers, and disconnection of the main stem rivers from their tributaries, which would normally provide that fertile spawning habitat. So that is one of that process we also see in the East Coast. Actually, the logging in the Northeast, in Maine in particular, they would sort of propel logs downstream, and it would take out a lot of the landscape features on its way, so much so that decades after that practice has stopped, there's almost no sediment transport down the rivers, and that has a really big impact on the habitat diversity within river channels. And so there's professors out of University of New Hampshire and University of Connecticut that are studying that sediment transport, affectionately known as a pet rock study, where they actually attach pit tags to rocks and map how far they move downstream. The reason I bring this up is they're coupling that study with restoration practice of large woody debris installation. And this is something we use in our dam removal project. It's a practice in trout habitat restoration here in the Northeast. And it is the use of wood within a river system to create this force, this energy condition where you're using actually the flow of rivers and water to carve out a heterogeneous river bottom. So you have this very deep pool that might be in one part of the river, and then maybe a shallow, more fast moving area. And that's all using this wood feature that itself decays. So you're not creating a permanent fixture on the landscape, but instead kickstarting the function where the landscape can then continue to carve itself. So that was some of the earthwork that was in the film that was a little hard to see what they might have been, might have looked like in the end. They're installing those large root wads in the bank of the river system. We did a project out in Mystic, Connecticut, that and this involved a dam removal, but some of that same condition exists where you have a sediment that is flat and shallow and slow. And so once we removed the dam, it actually uncovered a large old tree stump that had been in the pond, and that same condition existed around this stump. So you get this scouring effect, and a deep pool formed right next to this old, hundreds of years old tree stump. And that's now, we've sampled that site. That's now habitat for brook trout, which would never have supported those sensitive cold water species in that area before the restoration.
Yeah, we had talked a bit about this with the team, and the question I had for Gwen, I was like, what were they doing when they were just dumping? They were making these big structures, and I didn't understand it. And so thank you for explaining that for us. I think maybe next to Curt.
So one of the big mission areas of Save the Sound is habitat restoration. Gwen's working on 11 different projects, mostly in Connecticut, but some in New York, out on Long Island, that involve marsh restoration, river restoration, et cetera. So there's a similarity in bringing back these rivers for particular species. In our area, we tend to focus on bringing back river herring. And, I think you're probably aware that some of the projects have been extremely successful. Down at Bride Brook, we brought 250,000 fish back in that river system, which are feeding striped bass and everything from egrets and herons up to, potentially whale and seal. So that's one part of it. And the climate change issues that are associated. And, they are different impacts here, as you know, but they're extremely serious for anyone who lives near water, anyone who breathes our air, et cetera. So there are interconnections there. So I'm going to turn it back to Anthony. And Anthony, did you have something you wanted to ask? I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. The question was for you, Curt, actually, and the question is, out there to share Melissa's favorite quote, or one of the favorite quotes about the blueback salmon being this sort of canary in the coal mine for climate change. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to what we're looking at and what indicator species or what sort of trends we're following with respect to climate change in the Long Island Sound region, and how we know we're being impacted.
Sure. Well, the impacts are many. A few things that I think most people are aware of. I'll give a little story. When I was about 14, me and my buddy had a license for 10 lobsters, and we would typically bring in 6 to 8 lobsters a day. Had a little side business. It was a great deal. Ate a lot of lobster. My son had the same 10 pots about 8 years ago. He got 1 lobster all summer. Lobster have basically moved out of Long Island Sound. They've moved north. But that doesn't mean that niche is empty now. We have many more blue crabs, a warm water species. So what we're seeing in Long Island Sound is a fairly rapid turnover from cold water species to warm water species. My brother Bruce and I remember going out with my father this time of year and fishing for winter flounder. We'd come home with a lot of winter flounder. There's hardly any recreational catch of winter flounder anymore, but there's lots and lots of summer flounder, warm water species, summer fluke. So the whole ecosystem is changing in that regard. We hope that life can keep up with it. We do have about the same biomass of fish, at least in the bottom of the sound, as we did 25 years ago. We've done a good job of keeping track of that. I'll just mention another project that Gwen's working on in the Farm River. She's, and I know, Anthony, you've been out there putting up a fishway. It's going to help a variety of species, but there's a very unusual subspecies of brown trout, a introduced species from Germany. But one of the things that's kind of cool, it's not only a beautiful fish, it's got a lot of orange and yellow in it, but it is a fish that likes, can live and survive well in muddy and warm water. And as climate changes, as we get more and more deluges of water in our rivers that are churning it up and creating muddy water, and as we also get warmer water, which we know we are going to do, DEP is looking at this subspecies as something that we may introduce in other streams. So we need to work with nature. We need to help the species that can survive, and we need to start to enjoy blue crab. So there you go.
Yeah, good message. Good.
Yeah. Great. So I think then I'd love to ask Melissa about the message of climate change and the need for climate action right now. Obviously, it's something that we're hearing more and more about and speaking more and more about, particularly in your case, and that trend certainly needs to continue. I wonder if you can talk a bit about the connection of climate action here in Long Island Sound and this region to other parts of the world, and the way that climate change as a global issue is still something that we can and should be acting on locally, and what we're doing about it here in this region with your help.
Sure. Thanks, Anthony. Well, first, almost everything is connected to climate change. Three of the most notable mentioned in the film are also affecting us here in Long Island Sound, in the Long Island Sound region. It's ocean acidification, warming oceans, and sea level rise. Not so fun facts for you guys. According to reports, between 1994 and 2007, our oceans have absorbed 31% of the carbon emissions from human activity during this time. And the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says that this is equivalent to 2.6 billion, that's with a B, Volkswagen Beetles in carbon on average each year during that study period. But our oceans have been saving us from destruction, and they keep global temperatures lower. But this can't last forever. And this is throughout the globe. This is not just our problem. But unfortunately, Long Island Sound is actually warming more faster than global oceans, 99% of global oceans. So we're also seeing sea level rise. It's risen nearly a foot in the past 100 years, and by 2050 it'll raise another almost 2 feet. But since our oceans have been saving us from destruction, we have to save them to save our planet. And so fortunately at Save the Sound, we're working hard to turn the tides of climate change. Bad pun there, but we really are. Whether it's cutting transportation emissions in Connecticut or throughout the region, we fight for energy efficiency and expand renewable energy. At the same time, Soundkeeper Bill Lucy is working to keep the sound clean from pollution that's affected by the acidification and nitrogen from polluting sewage treatment plants, especially during the strong storms that cause sewage overflows. And we're also working on mitigation and adaptation that Gwen is talking about. We use all these tools to stop climate change here, but we also have to use them to stop the effects of climate change. Whether it's getting our youth to fight in Hartford for legislation, working with our partners and our allies to get policies passed, but also we're working to make sure our government stays accountable to the goals that we've already established. And that's one thing that we've been working on the past 2 years in the legislature. So there is hope. There's new legislation all the time. The legislature has really woken up to the fact that climate change is real and it affects our pocketbook as well. So that's the one positive thing, is that if climate change affects our wallets, and that turns into action.
I'd love to bring it back around to Gwen to help us sort of connect some of these pieces. What Curt was just talking about with respect to the ecosystem changing, and we're seeing more warm water species than cold water species in the Sound, and then the restoration angle, And the way that, so I'd love to ask you to explain or talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing. I'm thinking particularly about Merwin Meadows, some of the work that we're doing that sort of ties all this together, using restoration practices to create more cold water habitat or habitat for cold water species. And then I'd also like, maybe at the tail end of that for Curt to come in and talk a little bit more about the difference in these ecosystems from where we work to the ecosystem and the river system presented in the film from a nutrient perspective, and the way that nutrients move in those systems, because out there they have salmon and we don't have the big what do you call them, Gwen? Charismatic
megafauna
that come upriver and die and deposit nutrients in that way. So to Gwen first, maybe to talk about sort of the connection between climate and restoration.
Sure. Yeah, I think to use a phrase that Curt mentioned, but it's really, really important here, is this concept of restoration to abundance. So Ed mentioned the commercial value of the salmon industry and really fishing globally. And there are many, many, many benefits beyond commercial for restoring salmon populations and herring populations to abundance. Those have food security values. But there's also the movement of nutrients around the landscape. So salmon eat a lot, they become really large in the marine environment, and they carry all of those nutrients up with them into the headwaters of the Olympic National Forest. So that is the main source, the main driver of nutrients. And you can actually drill into trees that are hundreds or thousands of years old in the landscape, and actually you'd be able to sample them and their genetics and be able to tell that the nutrients that those trees were nourished with came from the marine environment. So it has an immeasurable impact. That same impact is felt in our landscape a little bit differently, right? Where the herring populations that are the species that we are most often restoring are not these apex predators, but they are forage fish. And so they actually make the trek into our inland waterways multiple times throughout their life. They swim from the Atlantic Ocean and out into Long Island Sound up into our coastal streams. And then they spawn, they lay their eggs and they hatch. And those 1 in 1,000 may make it back downstream. And so all of those others, whether they be eggs or they be young fish, are nourishing another component of our ecosystem. And so there's some really I think very cool markers in our landscape for when herring are returning. Ospreys migrate with the herring. So if you see ospreys overhead back in the Northeast, then you know the herring are coming in. Serviceberry blooms, it's also known as shadbush because that happens at the same time, and that has to do with the temperatures of the streams. And so that's an indicator for the herring actually smell their way upstream, but they only come when the waters reach a certain temperature. And so there's these fish are a canary, right? So they are they're an example and an important part of indigenous national cultural significance, but they're also representative of all of these different ecosystem services that we're that through restoration projects we attempt to provide. The connection to climate change, both the practices shown in the film and the practices that we have at Save the Sound are intended to make the ecosystem be more capable of restoring itself in the face of greater pressures. So in our case in the Northeast, Dams are ubiquitous across the landscape. There's over 4,000 in Connecticut alone. And these are a literal wall, right? Fish smash their faces into them, but they're also, in climate change, when we're thinking about more severe storms, there's real human risks associated with these structures if they're not maintained. And hundreds of years ago in our industrial past, there was a miller for every dam, and someone who was maintaining these structures and whose livelihood depended on them. And in the vast majority of cases, with notable exceptions, but in the vast majority of cases, that's no longer the case. And so the resilience that a river can have by this one action of removing a structure and allowing natural processes to return is really significant in our region and globally. This is an issue. I participate and Save the Sound participates in World Fish Migration Day. There's species that do this all across the globe. It's amazing. There's migratory catfish in the Amazon, which are very cool. They just discovered a new species of 400-pound catfish like 2 years ago. So there's really an important component to the landscape. One last thing I'll say is this project that Anthony mentioned, that in Norwalk, Connecticut at Merwin Meadows Park, we're working in partnership with DEP Fisheries Division and their water quality program as well, to add another primary sort of research objective for our dam removal project. Because of the way that this watershed is positioned, there's a lot of groundwater input and into the system. And so we think if we remove the dam at Merwin Meadows Park, that we may actually have quite a significant change in the water temperature in the area that was formerly a pond. So much so that instead of a warm, shallow impoundment, which is not very suitable habitat for many species, we may actually have a cold water stream that'll provide refuge for our more sensitive species. So brook trout is a really a good indicator of stream health. And so we are working in partnership with the water quality folks and fisheries division to monitor for brook trout and actually monitor stream temperature at this site. And if our if this project proves out, this may be we may be looking for other dam sites that fit this criteria. So DEP has the habitat protection, cold water habitat protection map, and they use that map to assess conservation priorities. So to protect areas of cold water habitat, so that as there are more severe storms and warmer temperatures and drought conditions, they can protect areas to allow species to seek refuge. Yeah. What this would do would actually be increasing the area that would be possible for refuge. So that's just one example of a climate change and restoration project that we're working on now.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I was hoping you'd be able to break down for us. So before we close, we wanted to give all of you who have joined us for this first session a say in what film we do next. So just briefly to say that this series for us and this project is really a bit of a departure. It's not meant to be an overview or an in-depth dive into our work. We do webinar series for that, and we feel like we talk a good deal about our work because we love it, and it's great work. And this is a chance for us to explore some of the same forces or different forces that are at work in other parts of the world, and how those relate or are different from what we're seeing here. And what we can learn from those, but also just to be in conversation with one another and discussion about restoration and climate change and what we're facing as a human, as a global community. So with that said, we have two choices for you, and in a second here I'll pop up a poll for you, and you'll be able to just choose which one you'd rather do for next time. And we do not have the next time scheduled, but we will be reaching out to you on that. So the two options are significantly different lengths. So we're interested in getting your take on that. This one was 10.5 minutes. One of the options for next time is Agua del Yunque, which is water of the mountain, or water from the mountain. And that's a film that follows the path of a river, the path of water from the mountains down to the sea. And given the way that we work in watersheds and systems, that one feels quite relevant to the way that we follow water and work within those systems. Because after all, that's the way that nature often organizes itself. And the other option, so that one is 16 minutes, thereabouts. The other option is a mini series put out by Smithsonian called Last Call on the Bayou. And that is about an indigenous community in Louisiana that the marshlands and the bayou that they call home and that they rely on is being eroded and disappearing at an alarming rate due to climate change and sea level rise. And so it's a 5-part mini-series that outlines different aspects of life there and how they're responding to that through restoration primarily. So that one, I believe the total is just under an hour of all 5 parts. So I'm going to pop up a poll now for all of you. You should see it in a second. So you can just take your pick. So I'll give you a minute to do that. Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. Thanks, everybody. All right. So we are going to be doing Agua del Yunque for the next time. That's great. So we will be sending that link around as we follow up with all of you, and we'll hope you'll join us again. We're really excited that you were able to join us on this 50th Earth Day. We thank you for your support of our work and your willingness to engage in conversation about these issues. And the last thing I'll say is just on this Earth Day, we're really appreciative of the connection that we have to all of you in New Jersey or elsewhere, and the connection that we all share to this earth, this place that we call home. And we are dedicated as an organization, a group of individuals, to continuing the fight for restoration of these ecosystems and a closer living relationship with them, and to counteract and combat climate change. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to Curt, Gwen, Melissa, and all of you who joined us here today. We hope to see you next time. Take care, everybody. Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day, everybody.